as we move forward here, the first kind of topic that we want to dive into was basically how you guys view the concept of general versus specific movement skills, and what does that mean to you in your context? Or you'll hear coaches all the time say things like, "Stick to the fundamentals." Well, what are the fundamentals, and are those fundamentals actually fundamental movement skills that athletes at all levels, whether it be novice or competitive or elite athletes, need a wide grasp of both general and specific? But so it's a wide open can of a topic there. So just shoot away. Anybody, go ahead, start with us. What do you guys think about the topic of general versus specific movement skills or fundamental movement skills? I'll start then if no one wants to jump in. So for me and how I view it is obviously the older athlete we get, we want to be as specific as I think as possible with our athletes. So the environment that our athletes interact with, I feel should be as specific as possible. And now some of this discussion kind of goes around, the population, the context that you're working with. And so for me, like a general movement skill may be specific in another context, but if we're looking, let's say, a soccer player, specific for me, movement skills would be things that are centered, kind of ecological around the soccer environment. So playing basketball might be a general movement skill, or doing like an ace skip or doing like parkour would be general movement skills. And while those can be valuable, I feel for more novice-based athletes, as we get more competitive, higher level athletes, I think we want to stay as much as possible in a kind of specific environment, a specific task, that specific coupling as much as possible. I do not feel the higher level that we go, that those general movement skills are going to enhance one's performance in their sport. They may have benefits in terms of just, kind of maybe giving the athlete a different stimulus or stress to their tissues, their muscles, their bones, things like that. But in terms of, from my field, in terms of enhancing specific movement skills, I feel for an older athlete, a more competitive elite athlete, those general movement skills do not transfer or help in a specific manner. So if that's something you guys want to unpack and unpeel, go from that standpoint.
Yeah, Michael, just going off of that, I'm at Sporting Kansas City, Major League Soccer, and I work with a lot of the academy kids all the way up to our second team with the USL team. And it's, having been in soccer, having played soccer, it's a very similar, I have a similar approach to it in that respect where, even for maybe some of the kids that we work with that are 12, 13, 14 years old, may or may not, probably will never go pro, statistically speaking, but it's just good for them to develop these basic movement skills that may have transferred across a wide range of whatever they end up doing. They'll probably still end up playing soccer into their later years, even if it's not at a professional level, but they'll at least be able to develop these basic movement skills. And from a different point of view, it's not just developing the movement skills, but also it'll provide, like you said, that physiological stimulus. Just using an A-skip as an example, it's not just an A-skip. It provides a little bit of a low-level plyometric type of thing. And so that'll help build them physiologically. But as we move into, the professional athlete level, how much is an A-skip going to help a central midfielder who may not ever reach top velocity in a match, or may do so, but does so sparingly that it is just not going to be that effective for him? Whereas in that sense, a player like that maybe controls possession of the game a little bit more, doesn't really run around a lot, but a little bit more short accelerations. But a lot of those short accelerations are very different from an acceleration that may occur in like a track and field environment, where a short acceleration for a midfielder, I've noticed, is a lot of times they have to be obviously scanning the environment and seeing where the ball is, where their opponents are, and where their teammates are. So, the mechanics of the situation may differ given the constraints of that environment, being that they have to also be tactically aware and understand they have to perform the skill, but then also just check out their environment. So that's kind of where I come from it in a soccer context.
No, I completely agree. It's all about the context. I work with defensive backs, and sitting there doing stuff on air isn't really a fundamental skill. It's mirroring. Mirroring is a fundamental skill because you're always going to have somebody in front of you. So yes, fundamentals, yes, at a young age, you want to give kids as many tools as you can, but the higher up you get, you're going to have to be pretty much specific. You know, the law of specificity says that whatever you put in, that's what you're going to get out. So, like I'm saying, mirroring is a fundamental skill for people with somebody in front of them, and mirroring from different angles, mirroring from opening up, mirroring while moving forward. That's a fundamental skill. So it's all about 100% context.
I think Matt, you raised your hand. Matt, you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think the one thing that I would bring to the discussion, and it kind of goes hand in hand with what you were saying, Michael, and what everybody else was contributing, I think this is where the coach as an architect really comes into play, because I think that the actual discussion of general versus specific, I wonder if that's something that we're going to look back on in 5 and 10 years and say, what were we really discussing? Because isn't the task itself really shaping and controlling and defining the movements that are being expected of the athlete? So isn't it really then our job as the architects, as the facilitators of those activities and sessions, to be kind of keep that in mind in terms of the environment that they're going to be participating in? So almost from a general level, I wonder if that becomes almost a moot point or a moot discussion later in life. Are we going to be like, hey, we were worried about all these general movement skills, but obviously if I'm working with an athlete who is not participating in a specific sport and is here at my gym trying to just develop their overall athletic capabilities for just life, let's say, for example, well, certainly then I'm going to design tasks that are not specific to any sport, but just may include a variety of movement skills just because we don't know what context they may be asked to perform in the future. So as we graduate in age and in time, those
So I've got a question. If we're talking about developing the complete
conducive with movement skills that are required. And you're going to play football. Well, we're going to design things that are more conducive to that. So I wonder if it really comes down to us as facilitators really embodying that role more and more as we move forward.
Matt, awesome. You cut out a little bit there, but I think we got the gist of it. And Paul, go ahead. Continue what you're going on, Paul.
Yeah. So if we're talking about developing, for instance, a complete baseball player or a complete football player, or everything, when we're targeting specific movements, specific skill sets, is it better via whatever research you guys have conducted, and maybe anybody can sort of hop in on this, but have you found it better to target a specific thing and just develop that over and over and over, or to develop the athlete as a broad general matter and have him develop just his athleticism before taking on whatever movement he needs help with?
Paul, wonderful question. Anybody want to tackle that? Because that's kind of the gist of this discussion is, maybe for even a college athlete, do we need to build some of those general motor abilities in order for them to be a better, college baseball player? Obviously the context of a college athlete versus a youth athlete, that's kind of the discussion here. So anybody want to tackle it? Paul's great question there. Any baseball coaches out there that, want to, handle that one?
Yeah, I'll go with this one. I'm a strength coach in minor league baseball, so I've been dealing with kind of the populations for quite some time. You get someone on the youth level where you have a 16-year-old Dominican kid that might need to be more refined on specific adaptations where he is naturally athletic, and then you might find a kid that has a great strength base and needs to be refined on more of the general athleticism. So I think over the course of a team, if you're building a full baseball player, you want a little bit of that both. You want that dexterity to be able to adjust to whatever depth, whatever movement I have to make to field a ground ball, to adjust to a breaking ball, to do anything like that. But at the same time, you don't want them to be all that way. I need a certain level of strength to handle 140 games or 162 games. I need a baseline of athleticism on both sides of it, both from a strength in the fundamentals and from a specificity, because I don't know where that ground ball is going to take that kid. I don't know what route he's going to take. I don't know how he's going to adjust to the pitch. I have to be ready for all of those things, but have a baseline athleticism that's going to keep him durable through our season's a long time. It's 140 games in 150 days.
Just out of curiosity, if you don't mind, I'd just like to follow up with a question for you when you're talking about baseball players. And even though you're building all of these, different ways to develop the full baseball player, you're always instructing from a position of situations that may occur on the field. Is that correct?
You kind of have to. I mean, if we're not doing something that's going to affect on-field performance, then it really begs the question of why are we doing it?
Right. No, I agree 100%. And that's why I was wondering, can we ever train something without context and still see that improvement on the field, which kind of goes back to this general motor planning or motor ability standpoint. Can we really ever divorce it? It's just a question that I'm always throwing around in my mind, and I'm sure we're always talking about on places like this.
Yeah, I think on my level it's hard because I work obviously as a strength conditioning coach. I'm not teaching the fundamentals of receiving a ground ball. I'm not teaching the fundamentals of a swing. So how can I replicate those things in the gym? It's kind of hard without that specific context. But in, say, like a lunge progression, I can be as variable as I can. I'm not always doing forward lunges. I'm not always doing reverse. I might do like some of the ecological dynamic stuff. I might have them do a different rep or a different lunge variation every repetition or a different tempo every time, just to give him a little bit more of that variability. But like you said, I can't directly replicate fielding a ground ball within my gym setting.
And that's a great point, Joe. For our strength and conditioning coaches that are kind of confined to the weight room and maybe not able to, have that specific context of, let's say, their sport, we feel that behavior transfers. So in the weight room, like we talked about, encouraging our athletes to be adaptable, to be force themselves to, open up degrees of freedom by exploring different areas of, say, a lunge progression there. So they're not always doing the same exact stance or distance or tempo. We feel that behavior also transfers to sport. And so if we want our athletes to be adaptable, we want our athletes to make decisions, we want our athletes to have autonomy and ownership, shouldn't we give them some of those keys to the car in the weight room as well? Because I think that behavior and giving the athletes those keys to the car, even though it's in a weight room setting that's decontextualized, will transfer to more of a contextualized environment, because it's more than just the information movement coupling, but also I think the behavior things that we can give our athletes also transfer to the sport. Any thoughts on that?
I would agree,
Yeah.
Michael. I think that if you're encouraging exploration and you're encouraging searching in the weight room, by the way, collegiate strength and conditioning coach at the Division III level, I work with all of our varsity sports. And I found that if I encourage that exploration in the weight room, athletes have started to discuss with me how they're seeking and finding information when they're doing some of their skill work, which is outside of my jurisdiction. I'll always tell, like we were just talking about baseball, I'll always tell the guys, you don't want me to teach you how to throw, but we can foster some of those behaviors, like Sweefel said, and I have seen good transfer from that.
Just for clarification, I'm Garrett Boyum. I'm also logged in as Sean just in case he had to take off. So that's why it may say Sean Mishka when I'm talking. But so I guess the at least part of how I think about it when we're doing the variable reps and all that, kind of this may be a little bit more traditional, but we're also preparing the tissue and the system to handle the variation that may occur once they get to the sporting context. Because like was mentioned before, we don't know what positions they may end up in, and they may not be the most technically perfect biomechanical positions that they end up on the field. So having a situation where it's a controlled environment and we're actually able to stress the body and those tissues in those different ranges, hopefully will prepare them to be better able to handle that once they get into a more dynamic, variable environment.
Anybody want to add to that? Also, just again, at the bottom there, guys, they're in the middle, there's a chat. If you ever have a question, press the chat. Or if you want to make a comment, press the chat. I'll be able to see who's, say, I want to speak or something like that. That way we can just have a really good flow. Or if you have questions, obviously we have 41 people here present. So that's a great way for us to really facilitate some more discussion when we're not interrupting people speaking. So feel free to use that.
Yeah, just building on that, coaching high school girls soccer, there's a lot of girls who play too many games and almost get too much specific work just within that context and aren't prepared from a strength perspective. So we have to spend a lot of time in the off season, like Garrett was saying, just intrinsic foot strength, ankle stability, hip stability, spending kind of more time on that because they aren't ready for the demands of the game, and that almost wears them down too much if that foundation isn't there.
Anybody want to tackle that one? Is seeing maybe kids playing maybe too much sports, too much activities or games, and not enough time building. Just again, that's a discussion. The general physical capacities. That will those general physical capacities assist them if they're playing a ton of games?
Can I just ask what you kind of define as those general tasks or those general abilities? Back to Jonathan, obviously that is.
Yeah, for there, a lot of what we'll do is just, in the weight room, it's just kind of holding a calf raise. Sometimes kids can't hold that for more than 3 seconds. Then you think about asking them to do a dynamic change of direction on one leg while turning in a game. Kind of scary to think about missing that basic strength underneath it. That's probably the clearest example I have.
Yeah, I completely understand the premise on that. The one thing I always find interesting is if something is termed plyometrics for kids, it's quite scary. But if it's termed hopscotch, it doesn't tend to be as scary. So quite often I think we may jump a little too deep into that element of strength with kids. Completely understandable that concern is there. But I think if you look, there's a group in the UK called Boeing. They have some fantastic games that will develop those strength capacities for them, but it's all then within a game setting. So the dynamic nature that they'll encounter is very much present throughout that, which is always the way I try to go about that element with a younger population.
Yeah, another question, kind of building off that, how are we assessing that they don't have the physical capacities, their strength, that they need to be present on the sport, otherwise they're at increased risk of injury? How do we know that? How are we assessing or evaluating that? Because let's be real, there's young kids, 5, 6, 7 years old, jumping off 40-inch playground sets and perfectly fine. So how do we deem that they are not strong enough when they are playing 4 games in a weekend or jumping off a playground set and they're not getting hurt, they're not getting injured? So my question would be, how do we assess that? I used to be in that same boat. Like for me, it was, if my athletes can't skip, they're not coordinated and they're not gonna be able to run fast. And now I'm like, who gives a shit if they can skip or not? That has for my mind, no deeming that they could ever run fast or they're lacking coordination. So I used to be the guy, we got to learn how to skip and hop and do these fundamental movement skills. And then I realized I just don't think any of those things really matter because, again, there's no context to them in terms of the sport. I can see kids, I've had professional athletes that can't do a lateral skip, yet they're playing professional sports. So, where do the fundamental movement skills end? And, where are they limiting athletes in that regard? So that's just, again, another open topic there. But some maybe for you, where'd you go there? Jonathan, if you want to answer that one.
Yeah, I think a big piece of that question might just be my specific setting, coaching a high school girls team. That's on the girls' side, they'll go through puberty, grow a lot, but the muscle strength might not catch up. So it's kind of that specific context. They're controlling a lot more mass without the strength right away. And so that might be a couple-year window where it's really obvious when they can't kind of control that and you have to focus on it. Yeah, with kind of the point about, just because someone can't do a general exercise doesn't mean they're not a good athlete. I think you really have to look at that specific athlete. Is there an issue with the movement that you think might cause either a performance issue or a health issue that intervention would affect? And if not, then we're better off just leaving it alone and focusing on something more in their environment.
Awesome. I'm sorry if I butcher anybody's name. I'm sorry. Marianne, you had a question?
Hi. Sorry, I haven't got any earphones, so hopefully you can still hear me okay. No, I was going to ask the same question, what it was that they were testing. If I think about the environments and the people I work with tends to be in equestrian and adventure sports. Sort of climbers who are very, very good dynamically may not be able to do the kind of strength stuff that you would expect a normal athlete to do, because they're working an entire body and they're moving in a way that uses a lot of it's very dynamic. And again, with the riders and horses, they haven't necessarily got a great core strength if you were to put them in a plank, but they're able to transfer energy and tension across their body where they need to, and not getting injured. And quite often the ones that then start doing very sort of repetitive training, if I think about equestrian sports or dressage, they're the ones that get the injuries, interestingly, by not having enough movement variability and moving in context. So doing something at speed doesn't need to be necessarily slow. They don't need to be powerful enough to slow it down, for example, and make the same shapes. So I was just asking why he, what made him think that they weren't developing the way they needed to by just doing lots of games. Hope that makes sense.
Well, you know what? There's one thing that comes to mind. It begins to beg the question, like, when does the activity itself really become the expression of that which needs to be trained in terms of strength? So in other words, instead of particularly looking at a particular qualifier as like, oh, we have to develop these capacities, then maybe to some degree we need to examine, should the game itself be telling us what we need to train further? And maybe that could be the way in which the task, as well as the organism and everything collectively combined, can be a better guide for us in terms of our activity and representation.
I think too, on that topic of like injury or playing the games too much, I think it comes down to what was mentioned before, repetitivity. So if you do something a lot over and over again, maybe that stimulus, your body stops adapting to it, and then you have some sort of degenerative changes that occur. And so switching it up, doing something like strength training or changing up the activity allows the body to, it provides a new stimulus and the body then adapts. But I think the back to the main question of when it comes to skill development, what is the most important component to developing skill when it comes to the sporting activity that they're a part of? Do we need to have progress in a linear manner, or is it more nonlinear, so to speak? And so I guess that's kind of, I think, the main question that we're trying to get at here.
As someone who, like I mentioned, Division III strength coach, I support a variety of sport coaches. I think sometimes, and this isn't, I'm trying not to rant here, it's just a frustration and reality from a lot of some of these conversations, and the adjustments that I think we as professionals would prefer to make are outside of our control, like how I would schedule a practice plan. I'm not a sport coach, but a lot of the changes in that capital P progression or adjustments from general to specific aren't in my control. So to Matt's point about being responsive to the situation or the context, he mentioned the game. I'm just talking about like what my coaches throw me. A lot of my choices, like Jonathan mentioned, might just be like, I don't have here's this specific strength metric I need to see before I do this type of change of direction or agility. What I see it more as, like, I'm just constantly trying to make my programming responsive to the individuals that are in front of me. And that could be day to day, week to week, or season to season. And that's the only way, because I have gone, like Michael mentioned, where you're like, oh, I'm going to come up with these progressions and that's going to help me feel comfortable. And I have to realize that this is all super complex and there's no way around it. I probably will never feel super comfortable with all the decisions I make, but I do hang my hat on and sleep better at night when I put myself in a position to respond to the individuals that are coming in, which starts with asking questions, talking to the athlete, getting a sense of how they perceive their game and what the gaps in their game are, so that I can offer a training plan that is going to be general, but at least maybe fills some of their bucket and helps underpin what they're trying to do as an athlete. I hope that makes some sense. Being responsive versus overlaying my own progression to their reality or their training paradigm.
Yeah, kind of building off that, one of the things that kind of stemmed this discussion, one of the discussions was, kind of a comment we made is, we sometimes, those that are applying more of an ecological approach, a lot of people just say, well, all you need to do for agility or sport movement is play tag. And we kind of rebuttal that is that tag can be a great choice for a youth athlete, but what we're trying to do, understand that we're trying to get our athletes to interact with the information that they'll encounter during sport. So tag, while maybe a good choice for youth athletes, is definitely not a good choice for an experienced or elite athlete, because tag does not represent any of the kind of the information that one will deem in a sport. Whether even like football, where it's kind of tackling, that is not tag. So we just, one thing we got a bad response was, well, tag is a great thing for all athletes. And it can be, but we do not think that would be appropriate or applied for an elite level athlete. And countering that, a question we saw on the side there would be kind of vertical jump. Obviously one of the questions was a volleyball athlete, that the context of jumping in volleyball is you're always kind of interacting with the information of where the opponent's at, where the ball is set. You might have a different timing with each jump. Will enhancing just pure vertical jump in a 2-foot manner, will that actually be applied in a volleyball setting where that is never the situation? So I know we have a couple of volleyball people here that work not only on the coaching side, but also the research side. Any in comments weighing in on that topic?
Yeah, hi. One of the things that you just mentioned is something we talk about all the time in our office with in regards to recruiting. And we have athletes tell us, hey, well, I can touch 10 feet 2 inches, and I can block touch this, and this is my vertical max. And we oftentimes joke that, hey, that's awesome, but what turns out is that when the game gets played and in the context of reality of volleyball, you rarely will see an attacker at our level hitting the ball at 10 feet. And so for us, it's a little less, it's kind of one of those myths that people have, is that, oh, she's a 10-foot toucher, she's going to be an elite volleyball player. And it turns out that it's pretty far from it.
Ryan, I know you've done research at the University of Nebraska with the volleyball team. I think you've looked into some of these things in terms of just the differences in kinematics in terms of doing an approach vertical jump versus doing an approach to kill or spike a volleyball. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, and like you just said, like you can have your general ability to jump and reach like a 10-foot reach with a vertical jump, and just by the nature of introducing kind of a multi-dual task to that and like hitting a volleyball, you're never going to reach that height in the task itself of hitting a volleyball. So now, on the other hand, to play devil's advocate in a way, does that mean that we shouldn't be encouraging, our athletes to improve their maximum height reach as possible? Probably not, because you take an athlete who can reach, say, 9 foot, and maybe in the actual spike, she reaches like 75% of that. And let's say you take that 9-foot jump and increase that to 10 foot, and then she still reaches 75%. Well, she's still achieving a higher height in the task itself, which will give her a better position to hit the ball from. So there's a mixed bag here when talking about developing general versus specific. And I think a lot of times you can take specific and really kind of go down this rabbit hole with it and just get lost and really end up not really doing anything to improve your athletes as well.
Yeah, great point, Ryan. So that's another great question. Again, does raising the general physical capacities of your athletes also raise the specific capacity of your athletes? So does adding a 100 pounds to your squat does that also increase your ability to produce force in a specific context? Or in Ryan's case, increasing, from a 9-foot approach vertical jump to a 9.6, does that also increase your ability to jump 6 inches higher in the context of a volleyball game? That's another great question. Baseball guys, I'm sure you guys see this a lot as well. Does hitting off a tee, does that actually correspond with their ability to hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball in the context of the game? Does adding 10 miles per hour in their exit velo off a tee also increase 10 miles per hour of their exit velo in a live hitting situation? So another great question by Ryan there. That's kind of the topic we're talking. Does those general capacities increasing, does that kind of increase the whole capacity of the whole system?
That's kind of a really interesting question and an interesting point right there when you discuss hitting off a tee and correlating that to facing live pitching in a game, because there's a very different set of mechanics involved with hitting off a tee, which is sort of hitting a stationary object versus hitting a moving object or a fast object. You also have to have the right optical, you have to be able to see the ball, you have to anticipate where the ball is going to be. So that's a little bit more difficult movement wise, I think. So I haven't necessarily, I've found that like soft toss or front toss, when you're already throwing a moving object, helps correspond movement to hit a faster moving object. But when you're hitting a stationary object, while if you can focus on a certain thing that's going on, like say for instance you're focusing on your attack angle to the ball, then that can help. But in as a general matter, it doesn't help train your eyes in order to be able to actually take that forward in order to take, hitting a stationary object versus hitting a very fast moving object. So while those are correlated, I'm not sure that just training T will also help increase in game, as a specific example as to what you were talking about.
Great. Lauren, you want to have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to work Zoom. Well, first off, this is awesome. This is my first time joining in on this and listening to all of you guys. And I just want to make a comment on the volleyball side of things, based on some testing we've done in our gym. And that is that your vertical jump touch, we use a Vertex or whatever machine or all the different varieties. There's, in my opinion, absolutely zero correlation between that and your ability to jump and hit a volleyball. Simply because we as human beings are goal-directed. We're goal-directed. Everything we do is about the goal we're trying to achieve. And if we as an organism can see that we can achieve the goal of hitting the volleyball where we want to hit it with the intent we want to hit it without max jumping, why would we need to max jump? And yeah, people say, well, the higher up you get, the more angles you're going to create on the court. Whatever. You don't need angles. You hit somebody's fingers and the ball can go 50 feet out of bounds and you're still going to score. So it to me, that argument that being able to jump really high on offense is, as an attacker, is somewhat limited. It's not a really great argument. I think it's a great argument for defense as far as blocking is concerned, to basically raise the net an extra 3.5 feet with your arms when you're up there blocking. But when you're attacking, I think if your goal is to simply score a point and you're left to the opportunity to explore how to score a point in all the various different ways to do so, jumping high is not necessary. So I think that correlation between saying, well, this person can touch 10 feet on a testing measure, but never does when they're hitting. We actually have kids in our gym. I work primarily with the youth. We have kids in our gym who actually, based on using the vert chip, jump higher when they're attacking a ball than they do when they're testing it on a Vertex. And again, I think that's because it's a goal-directed behavior. So I think when we separate out a general ability like jumping from the actual context in which it happens, it's like the sprint testing at the NFL Combine. There's no correlation. It just gives us something to measure, and we're addicted to measuring things that don't matter.
Mike Lane, you got a comment as well?
Can you guys hear me okay? Nod if you can, I guess. I read my internet is unstable, so I'll give it a go anyway. But yeah, Lauren, you actually just kind of hit it really well with what you said about the NFL Combine. That was my thought as well. I mean, everybody probably is familiar with famous Tampa Bay Buccaneer Tom Brady's Combine video, and we all know that he's if not the greatest of all time, he's probably right up there. And my thoughts on this topic are more along the lines of how there are very general abilities that people feel like are required for sport performance, and people are really good at measuring sport performance. But what people, I think, struggle with, I know for me very much so, is that it's really hard to measure the actual transfer between what is general and what actually goes towards sport performance. And so I wish I had some answers towards that. But the thing that I always kind of fall back on is just make sure that as you're improving these general abilities, that you're also continuing to rehearse the specific abilities. You won't actually even know if it's making a difference or not. Anyway, thanks, guys.
Any additions to some of those comments? Anything? No, I think that's obviously a great point. I don't think anybody's saying the general things, the general physical capacities don't matter at all. But what a lot of people are saying is, whenever possible, is try to couple that, the improvement of those general capacities in the actual task that the athletes will face in their sport. So if you're working on improving a vertical jump, that's a fine objective and goal to have. But as much as possible, try to couple that with the information that the athletes are going to interact with in their sport. Same with baseball. I mean, a huge topic in baseball now is again, hitting off a tee or hitting off a machine. Well, those are decoupled from the information that the athlete has to perceive and pick up in order to have a successful movement action in the sport. So are those things actually productive, or are we just wasting the athlete's time and resources on those means and methods? So that's kind of a closing thought on that topic. Anybody else? Again, feel free to leave comments on the side. We can go this discussion wherever we want to take it.
Michael and all, if I could, one thing that I seem to see that's lacking is everybody keeps comparing the movement patterns themselves, the movement actions themselves, which quote unquote emerge, but without actually really tracing it back from an ecological perspective as to where our scope or our scale of analysis probably should be in order to really analyze the tasks or the problems that exist. And that is, in my perspective, the information that our movement is going to be coordinated, coupled, and organized around. So when we're talking about the transferability, especially as we move up level of mastery or skill, at least from my perspective, because of course I work with NFL players, and I know I saw a few comments, again, rewinding back to the whole tag idea, but really we have to look at those two respective activities, that of tracking and then attempting to tackle an individual in space versus attempting to track and then tag a person in space. We see there are significant differences, maybe not so much on the surface, but we have these changes within the movement task that will often have a huge impact on the way that the movement solution is being organized or what is emergent from. And so I think there we have to say, okay, what are these two movement problems in these practice tasks or in this competitive environment? What do they have in common? What do the problems themselves have in common before we ever actually get to the solution and how the solutions are being organized or carried out? And then, from there, what key specifying information is channeling or guiding the control of that movement or coordination of that movement? And then finally, what vital information may be lacking or missing that would then maybe change our perceptions, maybe change our intentions, change our decisions that we're going to make, and then ultimately change the actions or the overall composition of that movement solution. So I think, to me, when we're starting to compare that general versus specific, and of course, those in ecological dynamics, and myself included, have often been guilty of utilizing these ideas of representative task design or representative learning, there's some questions then that arise specifically from a practicality standpoint, such as how representative is representative enough? Or what, if we think that these general movement abilities or general perceptual movement abilities have some carryover to the higher level of athlete, when does that transferability run out? Like, when do we transition from more general to more specific then? So just a lot of thoughts going on in my head, but a lot of them, again, stem from the actual movement problem analysis and the information that exists there to guide our performers. So I know I just said a mouthful without actually asking anyone anything, but if anybody has any points, counterpoints, or things to add off of that, by all means.
I've heard a very good analysis, kind of trying to justify how representative we need to go, or how far into that game style we would need to go, from a combat sports person recently, where the stakes can't always be at the highest level, because if you train as if you're going to compete, you'll never get to the point of competing, because you'll just be broken up way too often. You can't take that volume of heavy damage. And they use a very good analogy of poker. If the stakes are too high, you're likely going to back completely out. And if the stakes are too low, you're going to jump in wholeheartedly because there's nothing at risk. So while it's a very, and this is, I suppose this is why we're all here, it's trying to find that sweet spot of what is the most appropriate level. And yes, I saw Lauren commenting there, it was Stu's podcast, I can't remember the gentleman who was on it, but it's about finding that sweet spot and then going there with your athlete to see what they're giving back to you from that situation, and then trying to create those little links. I think a big thing for me was I used to focus on trying to trying to get my athlete to solve the problem, but then would slightly neglect what comes before that situation. So from a basketball context, if we're working on particular movements in that setting, forgetting or removing the context of before and after, where they have to then start to move into, okay, well, you've solved this movement problem, but what comes after that? So I think if I were to give an NFL example, if you've solved the problem of your wide receiver making a catch out wide and they stop, and then that's where you stop your drill, will they then no longer move forward in that and maybe make a run downfield? And I know I've, again, said a lot in that situation, but finding a sweet spot of what's the most appropriate stake for your athlete at that time, and then layering it with context before and after the problem you're trying to solve, was how I've gone about trying to solve that problem.
And this is obviously a difficult situation for anybody that's in a team setting, because you're going to have anywhere from dozens to multiple dozens of athletes, and it's hard to set up a task or environment that matches the challenge point for each one of those athletes. So anybody in the team setting, have you guys found ways in terms of finding that sweet spot, that challenge point that it's difficult for the athlete, but it's not too difficult and it's not too easy? It's that sweet spot in a team setting where, Taylor mentioned Division III. Anybody knows anything about Division III or high school, you could have some crazy ranges of athlete abilities within a group setting. So I know that's a huge topic, because one of the knocks on an ecological approach is, well, it's more of an individually based setting. It's hard to apply in terms of a group or a team dynamic, because you could have such wide ranges of where that athlete sits on kind of that time scale of where they're learning. So any thoughts on that point or that process with a team athlete or team sports?
A lot of times I'll just say, introducing an exercise, kind of point out maybe 3 different levels that an athlete could focus on. So, say we're working on an attacking player in soccer, trying to separate from a defender. The first level could just be, you're just trying to create separation between you and that defender with your movement. The second level would be, you're trying to time it with the player playing you the pass in. Whereas the third level would be, I'm thinking about how I want to time that run and set myself up to finish after that. So sometimes you can have what would be the same exercise, players performing the same thing, but you can direct their attention to kind of different progressions of that, and we try to do that.
I'm a D3 baseball coach. Am I talking?
You're good, Rafi. You're good.
Oh yeah, I was like, wait, am I talking now?
We got you.
Yeah, so I work with 30 hitters at the moment, or not anymore, but yeah, 30 hitters, and we have small groups periodically throughout the day. And my goal, for each one of my hitters, is to sit within this honey hole of succeeding at a 35% rate to 50% rate, because that's more realistic in baseball, for at least at D3. And that's just not like batting average wise, it's just squaring the ball up, trying to keep it as simple as possible. So I set up the machine probably most days around 85 to 90 with that range. And it's going to be challenging for the guys, obviously, and they're not supposed to succeed at an 80, 90% clip, because that's not what baseball is. You don't succeed at that high level, especially on the hitting side. So what I try to do is challenge them and have them embrace that challenge. Obviously, some of my better hitters are becoming really successful at it, so I have to challenge them even more and more, maybe bumping up the velo or changing it to more breaking stuff. But I'm trying to get all my hitters to succeed within those parameters of 35% to 50%, because what we're doing game-wise. But I'm just not the smartest guy here, so I'm just trying to figure out all these movement patterns, just trying to listen to you guys. I'm wondering, what is the best way to warm up for, let's say hitting, right? I'm trying to get my guys to move as efficiently as possible with the strongest breaks as possible. And I'm wondering, what can I do for them to have them be prepared to hit? Because I know in the past, I didn't even think about that. We just got on tee, we got loose, and we started going. Now it's, let's get the med balls flowing. Let's get some PVC pipes in there. Let's do some hip mobility stretches and stuff, depending on who the athlete is. So anybody could touch upon that at all?
Yeah, great question. Anybody want, whether it be baseball or not, how are you guys approaching the warm up? Is it just a means to increase body temperature, increase the heart rate, things like that? Or how are you guys attacking the warm up in terms of kind of the great question that Rafi kind of put out there?
George, did you have something?
I had a comment more so on how setting up practices for in the team setting. So I just work in the facility setting, training pitchers primarily. But on the hitting side, I feel like even if you're able to create high arousal levels when you set up a machine 85 to 90 miles an hour with your whole team watching. So although it's not necessarily you're not necessarily specific or locked into every single player, you're still going to be able to generate high arousal, and then and then that'll lead to higher learning, and that in turn will lead to higher performance or improvement over the long term. It's almost like the environment can be used as a tool to create a better and more individualized learning environment. That makes sense?
So, Rafi, I guess kind of my thoughts on some of the stuff that you asked. When it comes to the machine, I think to touch on a little bit of what Michael said, it depends upon, like, when we're talking about representativeness and information, what information is the machine providing? So depending upon the machine that you have and how much you can manipulate it, it can provide certain spin rates, certain velocities, and it's going to provide ball flight information. So when I'm analyzing the hitting side of things, I'm looking at like what information sources are being presented in the training activity. And so with the machine, that's what I feel like we're magnifying that, or making that maybe more of the primary source of information for the hitter to be attuned to. And then when it comes to like attunement and information, we're trying to figure out how to get the hitter good at exploiting different information sources or things that are going to be most useful to the hitter. So for example, recently one of the teams that I'm at Missouri State as a GA, one of the teams that we did well against, or one game that we did well against an opposing pitcher, was we were able to pick out that like he changed where he had his hands when he threw different pitches. And so that's a piece of information that our hitters were able to exploit, knowing what pitch was coming. And so I guess when I'm thinking about designing training environments for our hitters, is trying to get them to be able to pick up different pieces of information that they can exploit to gain an advantage over the pitcher to help them be more successful. And so to me, it's about interleaving different information sources depending upon the resources that we have. So I would do more like short box mixing with machine, and then trying to mix in as often as I can live. And so that to me is like how I'd approach that. So hopefully that helps with some of your questions that you had.
Garrett, would you say that, like, say I watched a lot of film before our weekend series and stuff, preparing them to see what they're going to see during the weekend is important, just like you said, knowing what's coming? So say we're facing a soft throwing lefty who mixes in a lot of changeup and breakers, just setting that up off the machine is important, you think?
I think it's helpful. I think too, though, it's more important that they get used to seeing pitches thrown in a similar sequence to what they would see in a game, whether that's completely random or that you create a pattern that for them to try to pick up potentially. Because I think that's where athletes need to be good at being able to adapt to changes in the game, because the game is going to be dynamic. And so their ability to pick up the information that's going on in the game, so changes in terms of how they're being attacked, is important. And if the game is the only time that they're interacting with that, getting that sort of experience, then it might take them longer to get to the skill level that you want them to be at. And so I know Sean has talked about that previously with some of his football players, in that like he was playing, I believe, on special teams, and then he was never practicing any of those sort of reps that he was being asked to perform in the game. And so the game was his only practice for that. And so, your ability to get better at that is only as much as you play. So that's why sometimes you'll see players who, at least in baseball, because we play so many games, they get better over time simply because of how many reps they get in game. So sometimes I wonder if it's like really the game is what's sharpening their skill versus what we're doing in practice at times, depending upon what we're doing.
Perfect. Let's shift back to the warm-up, because I think that's a really good topic for a lot of people. And I know a lot of people start with the warm-up, but Peter had wanted to make a comment about how he shifted his warm-up practices recently. Peter, want to dive into that?
Yeah, what's up, everybody? Just for a little context, I actually am a physical education teacher. I've previously worked with everything from collegiate to professional athletes to your weekend warriors, but just really found my niche working with kids. And so as a former Division I athlete at the University of Georgia at the highest level in my sport, what I experienced was like a very, if you think of Katie Bowman's Move Your DNA analogy of movement as a buffet, it was like a very nutrient lacking dynamic warm-up, where it was like, we're going to do jumping jacks to raise our heart rate. We're going to do quad stretch and straight leg march. And then we might do some partner chases at the end that are a little bit more dynamic. And so that's what I started off doing. And it was this very, it was lacking these movement nutrients. And I'm actually just going to show videos to show what I've shifted to, where it's much more of a task oriented, especially in that activate and mobilize. So the way it looks, kids walk in, there'll be an instant activity of something that will raise their heart rate, but it's usually a review of the skill before. So it's like keep away. They have a yarn ball, they're playing keep away. Usually it's like very playful, so it's not super intense, but it's raising their heart rate. And then we move into these task task initiated activation or mobilize. So here you can see these are some fourth graders and they're on a balance beam, and their goal is to just pick the bean bags off the balance beam. So you're seeing a deep squat. You're seeing some of them go into a lunge position and then shifting over to a deep squat. So before, my activate and mobilize was, one, not engaging, two, it wasn't very nutrient dense, like there wasn't a lot happening. And I've shifted over to these. I've got some other ones like wheelbarrow, not races, but just carries. That's not a movement prep. Here's another movement prep, leapfrog. Like we got, again, a deep squat. We've got some low level plyometrics going on with the jumping and landing. So shifting to a much more task oriented, like, okay, you're going to jump over this person rather than let's do a step and squat. So, and then we would end movement prep with like sharks and minnows or something. That's whatever we're working on for that day. But that's kind of the shift that I've made recently, is a much more task oriented, especially in that activate and mobilize.
Yeah, and a comment left by Lauren to you, Peter, is that you're obviously a physical education teacher, so your context is very non-sports specific. It's very general, correct, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think even within a sport specific setting, like we're talking about these general capacities, these general skills, like this is a time, the movement prep is a really great time to work on some of those general skills while preparing them for whatever that sport specific task that they're going to be working on is.
Yeah, anybody else want to comment on their warm-up? I know we have a lot of comments on the side if you want to kind of catch up. I know a lot of people have talked about, kind of shifting their warm-up in terms of trying to gain more than just a physical, increase in heart rate, body temperature, but also trying to engage and enhance some of the perceptual, cognitive, motor abilities of our athletes and warm those up and have our athletes start to become more kind of attuned to information and calibrate their bodies and degrees of freedom to that task at hand on that day. Anybody else want to talk about their warm-ups and how they've shifted it recently?
Just a real quick comment, or a little bit of a comment on that. It's not necessarily my specific warm-up, but something I've seen as I've, I don't coach soccer. I'm a strength and conditioning sport performance coach, so I don't coach the sport itself, but I have seen a shift in philosophy from other coaches, whether they're doing it knowingly or not. And so with soccer specifically, one thing I've noticed in a lot of very traditional soccer coach warm-ups, there's what they call the technical portion of the warm-up, which pretty much is just doing basic ball skills, volleying, passing, doing some sort of predetermined passing pattern to get more touches on the ball to start the session off. And that I've seen from the club level at the teenage years all the way up to the professional level. But one thing I've noticed, so last year I was with the University of Florida, their women's soccer team. And previously, the year before when I first started with them, they had done something very similar to that. But the next year, my second year there, they had completely changed up the warm-up. So what they decided to do was actually to pretty much leave out the traditional strength conditioning, like getting lines type of warm-up with the, stretching and all this and that, and said, okay, let's do something a little bit more specific to soccer. So what they ended up doing was they would organize different games in the sense of like, you may have heard of like a rondo in soccer, where basically like different players, it's kind of like piggy in the middle, where 4 or 5 players are around the ball and then 2 players trying to chase somebody else. So a different game pretty much every day with a different constraint. Maybe one player is a joker, one player is a bumper on the side, and they'll play that, but it's really in a short confined space. So the physical demand of that task is not very high. And so they're relatively confident that there's not going to be any sort of increased injury risk without necessarily having done a specific physical warm-up. And in between, so maybe they would play that for like, I'd say like 2 to 4 minutes. And then in between those 2 to 4 minutes, 2 to 4 minute bouts, we would maybe do some sort of light dynamic stretching in between for 2 or 3 minutes. And we'd alternate back and forth between that. And of course, there's not really, I can't attest any sort of empirical evidence because we didn't do any sort of studies on this. But what I did see throughout the season is, so the philosophy of those coaches and that team itself was keeping possession of the ball. And I've watched a lot of soccer in my life, and I haven't seen a team
at a collegiate level possess the ball that well and improve so well throughout the season. And, you know, we can always, you know, draw different barriers. Of course, the intelligence of the players themselves could have been a factor in that. They were a great team itself, but just watching them from this season or this past season to the season before, and their ability to implement what the coaches really wanted to see as a whole organism, as a team, was really fascinating. And seeing how the way the coaches decided to change from the first season to the second season was really interesting, and seeing if that was really correlated. So a little bit of a rant, but it was definitely a lot more specific to what might actually occur in a game, because as we know, you know, in soccer, basketball, this, that, there's not really stationary markers on the field. You have to perceive different things and be able to, you know, apply your own solutions to whatever you see. So that was definitely an interesting change in the way that I viewed warm-ups and what might be a little bit more effective moving in the future.
Awesome. And Lauren, I think you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, mine's actually going to mirror almost exactly what was just said in a sense. I mean, when we started our youth volleyball club, everything we did was the traditional dynamic warm-up where every movement was pre-scripted and there was a perfect execution of that movement. And that was in the intent of that was to move the athletes through a specific range of motion, challenge specific qualities so that we knew they were prepared to play the game of volleyball. Our shift now, we don't do any of that. It's simply playing the game, but we simplify the game. Our game of volleyball, the Olympic version of indoors 6-on-6, we'll have them play 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 on a much smaller court, so that there is a lot of movement, a lot of different ranges of motion. I think we can replicate almost all of the classic dynamic warm-up range of motion movements while including the context of the ball, the net, and an opponent, and the intent to score and win during a warm-up. And I think if we do that, we're actually helping them become not only better movers, but also helping them become better competitors and better performers within the sport that we play.
Jonathan, you want to build on Sudip's answer or response or warm-up?
Yeah, there's kind of a huge issue with soccer, in my opinion, is the kind of fake representativeness we'll put in a lot of stuff. There's kind of a traditional drill where people have the ball in their hands, toss it to a player, and they have to volley it back. And that's, you know, you'll see professional teams do that all levels. And there's never a situation in a game where, you know, ball's being tossed at you gently. The really important skill is kind of being able to pick up the flight of the ball even before it's struck, you know, by reading the chest, the leg of the player who's going to hit it. And so we've been trying to do a lot, you know, eliminating things where a ball's being tossed like that. And it might still be not too specific, more general, but everything the ball is being struck by a player with their feet, they have to bring it down there. So even if it's exploring different ways to strike a ball, you're still having to judge the ball coming off someone's foot. You have to adjust your body to it early. You can't expect the ball to come to the same part of your body every time. Same thing we was talking about with the passing drills. You know, there's no cones in the field. You know, we try to do either very specific where you're passing around defenders who will react the way you would in a game and try to make that representative, or again, moving the other way where you're exploring it without that, you know, it's not specific and you're not getting a kind of false reading from where those cones are and building kind of the unrealistic habits.
Perfect. So it sounds like most people's warm-ups now are getting, they look, they feel, they act, behave kind of like more like sport, right? I think especially if you're anybody that's been a college athlete knows that, I mean, you warm up 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 45 weeks a year. There's a ton of time spent on warm up that you're typically doing, like a knee hug, a quad stretch, et cetera, that if you just think about replacing those, even if it's just 5 of those 10 minutes with some kind of context, specific perceptual information, how many more repetitions that our athletes will get at some of these things that they're probably not getting period. So I think it's a very valuable time for many athletes and teams to kind of explore going down that route. It's been an hour, 10 minutes. Is there any other topics people want to discuss or talk about? Like I said, we plan on doing this kind of weekly. I know that a topic that's been brought up on the side would kind of be the periodization of skill acquisition and motor learning during the off season. I know we periodize kind of the strength work during the off season, but also there's been 2 really good papers out in the last year and a half discussing about how skill coaches and skill acquisition coaches might periodize kind of their off season in terms of discussing or organizing many of the topics that we just talked about in their off season process. So that might be a topic for a future episode, but any other burning questions that we want to kind of tackle here in the next 10, 15 minutes before we hop off and everybody enjoys kind of their Wednesday afternoon?
I wanted to kind of ask Joe a question with regards to the warm-up for baseball and kind of, or just even to the group, like what this, playing with these ideas makes more sense with something like soccer or volleyball or more of a field-based sport, but what would that kind of look like with baseball, it being still a field-based sport, but there's not as much interaction between individuals in the same way that it is in another sport? Because I know I tried with Missouri State to do some of that stuff, and a lot of the players were not used to being asked to be creative in terms of varying up their movements in terms of the warm-up. That's just not traditionally how things have been done, and so it was a challenge to try to figure out what is that balance to getting guys making sure they feel warmed up, especially if you play in a cold weather region. So I'm just kind of curious people's thoughts, especially Joe, on this.
I do have one question just about the question itself. Do you mean like getting player buy-in, or do you mean just asking them to be creative with their movement patterns?
I think it's my general question is like even the structure. So I know for myself, what I did is I started asking guys to do multi-directional lateral lunges, and that would be like the most variation I would do. But if I made things too complex, guys just didn't seem to respond well to that. So trying to keep it as simple as possible seemed to work better.
Yeah, I think baseball as a sport in general is terrible with how they've always been warm-up wise. You throw to warm up, you hit to warm up. That's kind of always been it. I think things are starting, especially at the professional level, to shift away from that. I'm blessed to be in the professional level that I have a ton of time with my athletes as compared to most. So like every one of my athletes has a movement prep program that's based on our testing, our athletic trainers testing, our PT testing, and they can go through that at any point in the day. So that's one way we do a warm up. It's also very dependent on what they're going to do that day. We have, I think, 7 different dynamic warm-ups as of right now that we can kind of roll out. If we want to go in season, go one every day in A, then Tuesday a B, Wednesday a C, Thursday a D, to break up that monotony. And I think most of our guys, we've kind of gone that way this way. Obviously, spring training just got canceled for us, but as we were progressing in spring training, we got a lot of buy-in from guys in mixing up the warm-ups so that it wasn't a group of monotony. Again, we have huge buy-in from our positional coaches. So we get guys to do about a 10-minute, movement prep before we even get to dynamic warm-ups. So we can assess, anything our guys are really deficient at as far as ankle mobility, hip mobility, sometimes doing like an FRC movement flow, ending in some movement challenges, like have them in 90-90, be like, all right, I'm not going to tell you how to get to standing. You got to figure it out. Just have a little fun with them that way. And then, like I said, we have the different dynamics. All of them go through pretty similar movements. There's 15 to 20 movements, depending on what stretch you do. It goes very quickly, and then it moves into some either, force production or rotational or sprint mechanic work on a given day. A couple of them have some light level plyometrics, hurdle hops, different stuff like that, lateral movements, lateral hurdle hops, anything like that. And then we kind of pass them off to our skill coaches, and our skill coaches, depending on whether they're pitchers, they'll go do weighted balls like a driveline program or patterning or bands or, their Jaeger band program, whatever they have them do that day. Or if we're just in a cage with our hitting coaches, they have a myriad of funny implements that are different drills with different colored wiffle balls, different patterning drills, different level PVC pipes, different this, different that they can take them through almost a secondary warm-up. Like it goes from general dynamic and general strengthening and mobility from a strength conditioning standpoint into some, perception, some reaction, some actual patterning before they get to, face that machine or step with a ball in hand and start working on their, their grips or their short box or a bullpen or anything of that nature.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks.
Any additions to that? If not, I'm just going to our final question. And this was kind of brought up by, I'm sorry again if I mispronounce your name, but Liran, but about how to convert higher ups. And Alan also asked this question about, or there's this kind of ingrained cultural, resistance to apply some of these concepts, whether it be a warm up or in their practice modalities, in terms of, applying some of these ecological approaches within these kind of just hard nosed or in, culturally or, sport ingrained habits that they don't apply these things. How can you guys go about changing the perception on some of these ideas or implementing them when coaches or an organization is resistant to do so? Anybody have any success stories on how to do that or how to approach it, more so than just, educating and staying on coaches and slowly they buy into it? Any other thoughts on that regard in terms of changing some of the perception of these ideas and concepts, and so they're more actively, applied in some of these traditional sport contexts? So everyone's having a tough time, huh? This is one hell of a question. I know that. And I think that's obviously, implementing a new concept or idea to a traditional sport or traditional coach, maybe an old school type coach or program is difficult. Education, obviously, that's obviously a simple answer that I think everyone's trying to do, but any other ideas? I think these are slowly starting to snowball. We'll see maybe some, for me in the football world, you're starting to see some, Power 5 or NFL teams implement some of these things. So that just makes it easier. Anytime Alabama or an NFL team does something, it's much easier for the grassroots programs to implement it because, they're doing it, but we know that's not a great reason because they're also doing many things that we would never do. But what are some things that you guys are working on or trying to change the perception and the lens that coaches are viewing sport through?
Can you hear me? You can.
Yes.
All right. So I've got a mic on. It is a difficult question. It's something I started trying to do quite a long time ago. Sorry, I think, is that too loud? And what was interesting is if you sort of just try and change things at one level, then the expectations often pull them back to wherever they were before. So, example, if you work with the coaches and then the kids or the athletes and their parents are then not getting the sessions that they're expecting, they'll often, sort of pull out. So I think it's something that's really difficult to do just at one level. And one of the things that I think has helped actually is just very gently producing lots of stuff that supports. So giving a lot of support and sort of gentle nudges, providing as a coach, coaching and workforce manager for paddle sports. I just started writing lots of articles and blogs and doing bits like that. So I just started creating lots of content and support that people thought was high value. And it was never explicitly different from what they were doing, but it started working. And so there was a big groundswell. And then when they started hearing about sort of ecological dynamics and some of this other stuff, they were like, oh, we've been doing that for ages. So they'd sort of got on board without being made to feel that they were in the wrong place to start with. So it's a difficult question though.
We just had a major transition this entire summer. Our whole coaching staff was very old school. We were just, hey, let's lift as heavy as possible and as fast as possible. So what we did was just a lot of reading, a lot of research, and basically trying to give as much information to our guys. We were talking to strength and conditioning coaches, athletic trainers, and we got to a place where we first screened our guys, basically saying, all right, the strength and conditioning coach we hired from off-site facility screened our entire team, and then basically broke down in Excel form, hey, these are your deficiencies, and it was like green. It was very simple: green, yellow, red, and red meaning you're at the highest risk of injury. And I think just seeing that was very important for the coaching staff and for the guys themselves, saying, hey, I'm pretty deficient at this and I'm at a higher risk of injury. And I think the most important thing for an athlete is just staying on the field or a play regardless. So I think for me, especially just seeing, hey, my guys are a higher risk of injury, this is actually really important. I have to keep them on the field, was the biggest buy-in for myself, I think. I mean, just a old school mindset. So we've moved to a more movement-based stuff based on how our guys move. It's not it's all about movement patterns. It's all about, hey, are you guys doing this the right way? And then we put our guys into 3 categories. Basically, it's like the rapid jumper. Basically, somebody needs to build strength. Somebody needs to build speed. And then the advanced lifters who they both move well. They're at all green for movement patterns. So they can become more explosive at this point. So I thought the biggest buy-in for myself and I think for my players were, hey, you need to stay healthy and this is the best way how.
I don't know about you guys, but if you guys do have some deep conversations with sport coaches, what I found is that many sport coaches are actually wanting to unload some of these things off their plate onto, say, a support staff such as a strength conditioning coach or a movement specialist. So, if I ask these coaches, what are you doing for warm up? They're like, I don't know. I just copied it when I played, or I just took it off the internet. Many sport coaches, at least in my experience, are more kind of tactical based, game plan based. They worry about those things, and anything they can offload from their plate in terms of someone like me taking over the warm up, taking over some of their individual or small group sessions. In many cases, they're all on board when they see some of the things that we're trying to kind of assist them with. Because again, any small school coaches probably have a lot of things on their plate, and so anytime they have an opportunity to kind of alleviate some of those things off their plate, I found them to be very receptive. And the second one would be during the off season with some of the teams that I work with. We apply these in our movement sessions, and they'll come and watch all these movement sessions, and they'll ask me questions about why did you do this? Where'd you come up with this? And obviously just say, it's basically from the game. You study the game, ask the athletes for their influence or input, and this is kind of what the environments and tasks that we've created. They go, that's a great idea. Would you be willing to sit down and talk about, applying some of these things when the in season or when the season comes around for some of our small group or for the first half hour of our practices? So personally, here in the States, especially with sports like lacrosse, football, basketball, I found coaches to be very receptive to wanting to learn more some of these things, because in their eyes, it's a way for them to spend more time in terms of the tactics and game planning and less time on some of these warm-ups, small group, individual periods that they sometimes just plug and play things from the past or from the internet or whatnot. Well,
I would
great.
agree with you, Mike. Sorry.
Awesome. Yeah. Again, we'll be on for about another 5 minutes. I know Sean and I and Jared will probably stay on here, and Garrett will probably stay on. So if you have any questions, or if you want to, leave questions on the side, or just stay on for a small little group here at the end. Otherwise, we'll be on again next week. So be on the lookout on our Twitter for the same kind of email here to hop on next week. Again, as Sean said, this is, for us at Emergence to have a better understanding of where everyone in the field is coming from. So we want these topics to revolve around things that you guys are passionate about, or things that you guys are struggling with, or areas that you deem maybe you don't agree with some of the things that we're talking about. We'd love to have some of those topics and those conversations, during this hour and a half that we have, each week. So please feel free to shoot those things over. We're really appreciative that everyone hopped on today. I wish it was better circumstances in terms of what's going on in the world right now, but hopefully everybody is safe. Your families are doing well, and hope you guys can stay say quarantine here in the next couple weeks. But really appreciate everybody. Thanks a lot, and hopefully see you guys again next week.